Thank you for attending the Summer Support webinar series, and this one is going to focus on Apple tvOS. We anticipate being here for about 25 to 30 minutes on content, and then there will be a Q&A section at the end. If you have any questions at any time, please place them in the Q&A section on the WebEx, and you have some moderators standing by to check on those questions as they come in. This session will also be recorded and available for viewing later online. So getting started, our presenters for today will be myself, John Applebaugh. I'm a customer success specialist here at Jamf, and Kevin Webster, who's a technical support engineer. Looking over our agenda for today, we plan to kind of focus in on using tvOS in education. And for most of this presentation, we're going to focus solely on the Apple TV generation 4 and greater, as well as tvOS 10 and greater. That will allow us to look at some of the automated enrollment that we can do through DEP now, as well as in-house app deployment, configuration profiles. We'll end on AirPlay, and then again, we will have a Q&A section at the end so that you can ask any questions that you have about content that we've covered during this presentation. Again, it will be recorded and available online at a later date. So getting right into it, we're seeing a lot more customers use tvOS in their education environments, and it's definitely becoming more popular now that there are new features for the 4th generation Apple TVs. For a little bit of history, the first Apple TV was released about 10 years ago. You might be most familiar with the 2nd and 3rd generation of tvOS, which ran an iOS variant. These were small black boxes with the silver remote that was incredibly easy to lose. More recently, the 4th generation came out in 2015, has a black remote, and that runs a new tvOS operating system. With this changeover, now with tvOS 10.2, we can actually supervise the device, which allows for things like DEP enrollment. You won't have to enroll through Apple Configurator. You can also enforce the MDM profile, as well as do a lot of the features that we'll be talking about today. For more information about actually how to set that up in your environment, we do have a technical paper online that you're welcome to view at any time. It's a great resource, but we will be covering a lot of that content here as well. Some of the typical use cases that we're seeing in education environments, this kind of represents a list, a broad list, but there's definitely others that are coming about. We're seeing most environments have some sort of setup where students or teachers are able to actually AirPlay to their Apple TV, either at the side of a classroom or at the front of a classroom. Teachers can use the Siri remote to actually use their voice to bring up content. A lot of times we'll see libraries or study rooms have some sort of display that teachers or students can actually use to share content. Another common use that we're seeing is people setting up some sort of digital signage for displaying like daily or weekly messages in common areas. In fact, here at Jamf, that's kind of how we have some of our Apple TV set up as well, to just kind of have a rolling cycle of messaging that we want people to see. So as I mentioned, beginning with tvOS 10.2, Apple TV can now be enrolled through the device enrollment program, which is very similar in setup to what you might be familiar with for iOS and computers. This allows for supervision, which again allows for a lot of features like being able to enforce the MDM profile. This next portion kind of assumes that you've already set up the DEP account or connected your Apple School Manager account to bring in those devices. So I'm going to kick it over to Camden, who can walk you through some of that initial setup for DEP.
All right, thanks, John. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the Jamf side configuration for tvOS, we're just going to take a quick look at the end user experience for automated Apple TV enrollments with DEP. All right, so first we'll see this setup screen at the beginning, where we have our Apple TV connected via Ethernet to the network. And we're actually not going to pair our remote with the Apple TV at this point. We're just going to wait about 30 seconds or so for the screen to disappear. And then at that point, we'll be proceeding with the automated enrollment. And so we can see the automated enrollment process is taking place here. And then, so once our Apple TV is enrolled, we'll see a configuration profile come down to put the Apple TV into conference display mode. All right, and that's all there is to it. So how exactly do we set all this up on the Jamf side? So first of all, we'll just want to navigate to our Jamf server running JSS version 9.98 or later, and open up the Mobile Devices tab. And next, we'll create a brand new pre-stage enrollment for our tvOS devices. And so here, we're just going to enter in some basic required information, such as the display name for our pre-stage, as well as the support phone number and the department name. Along with some of the checkboxes you might be familiar with the iOS side, we'll see some tvOS specific checkboxes. So one of the most exciting features here is definitely the Auto Advance through Setup Assistance checkbox. So this is what allows us to fly through all those typical setup screens we might see on the Apple TV without having any user interaction. We don't even need to pair the remotes at all during this process. All right, then. So once we've configured our pre-stage enrollment settings as necessary, we'll jump over to the Scope tab, and we'll just scope our new tvOS devices to our pre-stage enrollment. All right, so now that we've configured our enrollment settings, what else can we do with apps on tvOS? So at this point, we'll see isolated to in-house app deployments. So we'll go back to our Mobile Devices tab, and we'll hit the plus button under our Mobile Device Apps section to add a new in-house app. So deploying in-house apps offers some really exciting functionality for a bunch of different use cases, including digital signage, kiosks, real-time data displays, and basically anything else you'd want to display to your organization over an Apple TV. All right, so once we've clicked the app button, we'll fill out display name, version number, bundle identifier, and then of course set our operating system to tvOS. And so next we'll just need to choose our hosting location for the actual app file. So the options that we have here are going to vary depending on your environments. For this example, we're going to just choose to host it at a web server at a static URL. If you're a hosted customer, the Jamf Cloud environments, you can choose to host it on your Jamf Cloud distribution points if you have that set as your master distribution point. Some other options might include the JDS or hosting it in your Jamf software database if it's a smaller app file. All right, and so we can do some pretty exciting things with the in-house apps when paired with a single app mode configuration profile, which we're going to touch on a little bit later. All right, so now I'll pass it back over to John to go over some of those new configuration profile options.
All right, thanks, Camden. So you might be familiar with a lot of the payloads that are available for iOS. Most of these are similar in setup to what's available for tvOS. There's a few that we're going to focus on today that are unique in settings for the tvOS environment. That includes restrictions, single app mode, and a new conference room display payload. Starting off, we have a restrictions payload for Apple TVs. With restrictions, we can disable AirPlay on supervised devices, which is going to prevent AirPlay from being available on that tvOS device, as well as any mobile or computer devices within range aren't going to be able to see that as an available AirPlay device. We can also require the passcode on that first AirPlay pairing. That just prompts the user to put in the passcode. Similarly, we can disable the control of the Apple TV using the remote app for supervised devices, meaning that you wouldn't be able to use the iOS app for remote. You'd have to rely on the Siri remote. And also related to that is the ability to use the keyboard on a mobile device to input text into Apple TV. The last checkbox there either allows or enables or disables that functionality. Moving on to single app mode, Cameron kind of demonstrated a deployment of an in-house app, and you might commonly see this in an environment where you want to deploy an in-house app for like messaging and then stick it on just that single app for the remainder of the day. You can do this with single app mode, which is, again, is similar functionality to what you have available on iOS mobile devices. Important to note here is that if you do have a third-party app or in-house app, it has to already be installed on the device prior to this configuration profile being sent. It's recommended that you just use a smart group with the criteria looking for that particular app to be installed before having that configuration profile for single app mode go out. Some of the unique settings here, you have the ability to disable touch. That just prevents the ability to use the Siri remote or an iOS device to do touch input. Similarly, you can disable the ability to go to screensaver on the device. One thing to note about single app mode, and if the tvOS device ever reboots, it actually stays on the device, so it will actually go back into single app mode after the device is restarted. Moving on to a newer profile that we now have available just for tvOS devices is the ability to use conference room display. It's very similar in functionality to single app mode, except that it actually is a configurable message that you would display. In that video that Camden showed, you actually saw it go to a black screen at the very end. That was conference room display. And you can configure a unique message there, maybe your organization name, your school name, with instructions on how to connect to the Apple TV or something like that. This payload actually will overwrite the single app mode. So if you happen to have single app mode enabled, this actually will overwrite that and take over the Apple TV. Similar to that single app mode payload, if the device is restarted, it will once again go back into conference room display. If you happen to have apps that are other apps on the Apple TV, these can actually be updated in the background while conference room display mode is on. So some people might be able to use this as a way of hiding any kind of updates or installs they're doing of apps behind the screen, so to speak, by having conference room display configuration profile in place. And so one other feature that we kind of have now is the ability to kind of control AirPlay permissions to the Apple TV as well as and what iOS devices can go to that particular Apple TV. With that, I will transfer it over to Camden to take over.
All right, thanks, John. All right, so you can see here under global management in our JSS settings, we can access the AirPlay permissions settings. So AirPlay permissions essentially allows us to map one or more iOS devices to a specific Apple TV. This offers some pretty exciting functionality for areas such as healthcare or hospitality, where we might have a single Apple TV paired with a single iOS device in that same room. We could also expand that to buildings or any number of inventory items to create that mapping. So once we go into our AirPlay permissions, we'll see some various settings here. We have the option here to map AirPlay permissions based on a number of different inventory items, as we can see on the right there. So like I mentioned, room is definitely a useful one. We can also limit that by building. For schools, for example, if we normally would have access to AirPlay between different buildings, we could definitely lock that down, make sure that only devices in that building can AirPlay to their Apple TVs within that same building. So as long as the two devices have the same value within that mapping field, they'll have permission to AirPlay to each other. All right, we can see here under the mobile device inventory record and the Apple TV inventory record, we'll see that mapping take place here. So we'll see this appear as soon as we create that association between the two devices with that same piece of inventory information. All right, and then if we were to manually change that piece of inventory information, that's creating that AirPlay permission, we would see a little warning message pop up letting us know that if we do change this value, it could break that AirPlay permission setting and then disallow that device to AirPlay to that Apple TV at that point. So one possible issue we could hit in some environments here, if we are updating some of this inventory information using Active Directory or LDAP, if that information is automatically updated, we wouldn't really see any warning. We could see some issues with AirPlay permissions there. So if this is something that we'd want to control manually in the JSS, we definitely want to look at disabling that automatic LDAP inventory submission.
All right, we've kind of reached the end of our content that we were planning to discuss today. There's definitely more and more functionality that's being added for tvOS. If you've noticed, the 4th generation has a lot more abilities and functionality than previous generations of Apple TV. Similarly, MDM for tvOS is ever expanding, so I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't more functionality added in the near future to be able to remotely manage these devices. I do thank you for taking today. This was the 3rd of 3 summer support webinar series that we were doing. Again, this will be a recorded session and it will be available online online. Additionally, if you have any questions, please continue to submit those in the Q&A section of the WebEx, and we'll get to as many as we can. With that, we're going to take a question here from Carl. Carl asks, what are the enrollment options for devices that are not DEP eligible? So there's only really one other option for enrollment of Apple TV devices into the Jamf Pro server, and that would be Apple Configurator 2. So depending on how these were purchased or what generation they are currently, they're going to have to be enrolled through Apple Configurator 2. That being said, the previous to 4th generation, so 3rd generation, 2nd generation Apple TVs, they can be enrolled into Jamf through Apple Configurator 2, but they're not actively managed. It's just more of a way of collecting an inventory on those devices and making sure that you have accountability for device records. But 4th generation can be enrolled through Apple Configurator 2 and be managed through configuration profiles and in-house apps and things like that. Second question comes from Ryan. He asks, in the tvOS general inventory record, what is the difference between AirPlay password and Apple TV password? Do you have any idea, Camden?
Yeah, so the AirPlay password is going to be exactly what you need to enter to share using AirPlay. Whereas an Apple TV passcode, it's going to be what you'd use to essentially unlock that Apple TV if it was locked.
Excellent. So I guess we'll wait here for a few seconds in case there's any other questions, but that kind of reached the end of what people were asking about. There's definitely, beyond what we've talked about today, there are some remote commands available for Apple TV. I think it's just wipe and restart, so pretty similar to the functionality that you have on iOS. In that regard, it would just either remotely restart the device, which is handy if that Apple TV happens to be in a hard-to-access location, like in a cabinet or closet. And then the wipe device would just be a way of, being able to refresh that device, have it go through enrollment again, or be able to wipe it and get it out of your inventory stock. Well, again, I thank you for attending. It doesn't look like there's any other questions at this time. If there's anything that comes up, you're welcome to reach out to Jamf support through various methods, as well as check on Jamf Nation for functionality and questions and discussions. Like I mentioned, there's a technical paper that we have on our website for managing tvOS 10.2 related with Jamf Pro server. Thanks, everyone.